Welcome back to Dark Domain, where the most unsettling mysteries are only a phone call away. In tonight's video, we're diving into 3 stories that will leave you questioning what you hear in the dead of night. From unknown callers to voices in the static, these tales explore the terrifying consequences of picking up when you shouldn't. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Have you ever received a call that just didn't feel right? The House Party Nightmare. Back in the summer of 2010, I was a college sophomore, working part-time as a pizza delivery driver to pay for textbooks and late-night takeout. It wasn't the most exciting gig, but it kept the cash flowing. Most nights were predictable, delivering to families in front of their TVs or to late-night study sessions at nearby dorms. But one delivery, one hot August night, sticks with me to this day. It was a Saturday night and my shift was winding down. We'd been slammed with orders all evening, typical for a weekend. I was already thinking about getting home, grabbing a shower, and crashing for the night when my manager Vince called over to me. "Hey man, one last run for the night, you up for it?" I glanced at the clock. It was pushing midnight, and the exhaustion of the day was starting to set in. But the tips had been solid all night, so I figured, what the hell, one more delivery couldn't hurt. I grabbed the order slip and scanned the address. It wasn't familiar. Someplace on the outskirts of town, a good 15-minute drive away. The pizzeria was situated in the heart of a small college town, surrounded mostly by quiet suburban neighborhoods. But this address was farther out. Not far enough to worry about, but just distant enough to give me pause. I headed to my beat-up sedan, the driver's seat permanently molded to my shape from hours on the road, and keyed the address into my GPS. The thing was old, ancient by today's standards. One of those clunky units you had to suction to the windshield that took an eternity to load. My phone wasn't much better. I still had a basic flip phone at the time. No GPS, no apps, nothing fancy. It was 2010 after all. So, with my trusty flip phone in my pocket, I did what anyone back then would have done. I jotted down the directions on a piece of scrap paper and set off. The drive out was uneventful at first. The summer night was warm and the radio hummed softly in the background as I passed by familiar landmarks, the 24-hour gas station, a rundown strip mall, a few mom-and-pop shops that were already closed for the night. But as I got farther from town, the streets became quieter, more deserted. Streetlights grew sparse, and soon I found myself driving down a long, winding road flanked by dense trees. My headlights seemed to cut through the darkness like a knife, illuminating only the gravel road ahead. The directions had led me to what looked like an old, forgotten part of town. The houses were fewer and farther between, and the road itself was rough, almost like it hadn't been repaved in decades. My stomach tightened as I realized just how isolated this area was. After a few minutes of winding through the back roads, I found the driveway. Gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up to the house. It stood there, 2 stories tall, looming in the dark. There were no lights on, just the dim glow of my car's headlights casting eerie shadows on the overgrown bushes and peeling paint. It was clear that this place hadn't seen much upkeep in a while. The front yard was wild with weeds, and the house itself had that weathered, forgotten look about it. I killed the engine, grabbed the pizza, and got out. The night air was thick with humidity, and the silence was almost oppressive. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just dead quiet. I walked up to the front door, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the wooden porch. I knocked. The sound echoed, and for a moment there was nothing. I started to wonder if maybe I had the wrong address. Just as I was about to knock again, the door creaked open slightly, and a man appeared in the crack. He was maybe in his mid-40s, though he looked older. His hair was disheveled, and he wore an oversized, wrinkled t-shirt. Dark circles ringed his eyes as if he hadn't slept in days. He didn't smile. In fact, he barely even acknowledged my presence, glancing behind him into the darkened hallway. "You're here for the pizza?" His voice was low and hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in hours. I nodded and handed over the box. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. He handed it to me without looking directly at me, his eyes darting back toward the inside of the house like he was expecting someone or something to appear from the shadows. "Keep the change," he muttered, before quickly shutting the door with a hollow thud. The whole interaction lasted maybe 30 seconds, but something about it felt deeply wrong. I've made deliveries to all kinds of people, drunk college kids, half-asleep parents, but this was different. This man seemed scared. And that look on his face, that haunted, wide-eyed stare, it stuck with me. I turned to leave, eager to get back to my car and away from that strange house. As I walked down the driveway, I had the unmistakable feeling that I was being watched. My pulse quickened, and I threw a quick glance over my shoulder. That's when I saw him again. The man was standing at one of the upstairs windows staring down at me. The room behind him was pitch black, but his face was illuminated by the moonlight. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't blink. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I forced myself to look away. I hurried to my car, trying to shake the creeping sense of dread that was clawing its way up my throat. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped down the gravel driveway, not looking back. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the main road, the eerie house fading into the distance behind me. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why was that guy so nervous? And why was he watching me from that window? The next day, the curiosity got the better of me. I mentioned the delivery to a few of my coworkers while we were waiting for the lunch rush to start. One of them, Jake, looked at me like I had just told him a ghost story. "You're talking about that house?" he asked, eyes wide. "Yeah, why?" Jake glanced around, lowering his voice. "Dude, no one's lived in that house for years. Ever since that party." I frowned. "What party?" Jake leaned in closer, the color draining from his face. "There was this big house party there about 10 years ago. A bunch of high school kids got together to celebrate the end of the school year. But something happened, something bad. 2 of the kids never made it out. Cops said they ran off into the woods and just disappeared. No one's seen them since." I sat there, stunned, my mind racing. "But I made a delivery there last night. Someone was living there." Jake shook his head. "Trust me, man, no one's lived there for a long time." A cold knot formed in my stomach as I remembered the man's hollow eyes, the way he had stared at me from that upstairs window. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew something was wrong with that place. I had delivered to a house where no one was supposed to live, and whoever or whatever I'd met that night, they were still watching. The last delivery. Danny had been delivering pizzas for over a year, and he'd seen just about everything. Late-night prank orders, unusual topping requests, and the occasional customer who opened the door in pajamas. But tonight felt different. As he glanced at the address on the receipt, a slight unease settled in his stomach. It was 10 p.m., and the evening had grown quiet. The rush of dinner orders had tapered off, leaving the pizzeria with a calm, pepperoni-scented atmosphere. Sarah, his manager, called out from behind the counter, "Hey Danny, we've got one last delivery for the night. It's out on Carver Lane." Danny looked up. "Carver Lane? That's pretty far, isn't it?" "Yeah, it's that old neighborhood on the edge of town," Sarah replied. "But it's the last one, and they're offering a generous tip for the late delivery." He shrugged. "All right, guess I'll take it." He packed the hot pizza into his insulated delivery bag and headed out to his car. The streets were familiar at first, lined with cozy houses whose windows glowed warmly against the night. But as he drove further, the surroundings began to change. Streetlights became sparse and the homes sat farther apart, shadows stretching between them. "Why would anyone live all the way out here?" Danny muttered to himself, turning onto Carver Lane. Tall trees flanked the road, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. He slowed down, scanning for house numbers. Finally, he spotted it. A large, old-fashioned house with peeling paint and a dim porch light flickering like a fading beacon. He parked his car on the gravel driveway and took a deep breath. Just a normal delivery, he assured himself. Grabbing the pizza bag, he walked up the creaking wooden steps to the front door. An old brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head greeted him. He lifted it and let it fall. 3 solid knocks echoed into the house. For a moment, there was only silence. Then soft footsteps approached, and the door opened a few inches. A woman peeked out. She appeared to be in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back neatly and eyes that held a distant look. "Good evening, ma'am. I've got your pizza delivery," Danny said, offering a friendly smile. She nodded slowly. "Thank you. Please come in while I get your payment." Danny hesitated. Company policy was clear about not entering customers' homes, especially during late hours. "That's all right, ma'am. I can wait here." She looked past him toward the darkened street and then back at him. "Nonsense. It's too chilly to stand outside. It'll just take a moment." Feeling a bit uneasy but not wanting to be rude, Danny stepped into the foyer. The interior of the house was just as antiquated as the exterior. Ornate wallpaper, antique furniture, and the faint scent of lavender. A grandfather clock ticked methodically in the hallway. "Wait here," she said, gesturing to a small table by the entrance. "I'll fetch my purse." As she disappeared down the dimly lit corridor, Danny glanced around. Family portraits lined the walls, black and white photos of stern-looking individuals from decades past. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, eager to complete the delivery and head back. Minutes passed. The house was eerily quiet except for the clock's ticking. Danny checked his watch. "Ma'am, do you need any help?" he called out. No response. He considered leaving, but remembered he hadn't been paid yet. Maybe she forgot, he thought. He took a few steps down the hallway. "Ma'am?" At the end of the hall, a door was slightly ajar, a soft light glowing from within. He approached cautiously and knocked lightly on the door frame. "Excuse me?" Pushing the door open a bit more, he saw it was a cozy sitting room. An old radio played faintly in the corner, and a teacup sat on a side table, steam still rising. But the woman was nowhere in sight. "That's odd," he whispered. A chill ran down his spine. Suddenly, the radio cut to static, the hissing sound filling the room. Startled, Danny backed away and bumped into a small table, knocking over a framed photograph. He picked it up, intending to set it right, and froze when he saw the image. It was the same woman, but the photo looked ancient, like it was taken 50 years ago. His heart began to race. Something wasn't right. He needed to leave. Turning back toward the foyer, he quickened his pace. As he reached the front door, it swung open, and the woman stood there, her eyes now sharp and focused. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of disappointment. I'm sorry, but I have to get back," Danny stammered. "Maybe I can come by tomorrow to settle the payment." She tilted her head slightly. "But you haven't delivered the pizza yet." He glanced down at his empty hands. The pizza bag was gone. "How?" He was sure he had been holding it moments ago. The woman smiled faintly. "Thank you for bringing it. My family will enjoy it." From somewhere deeper in the house, he heard faint whispers and soft footsteps. Panic surged through him. "Have a good night," she said, stepping aside to let him pass. Danny didn't need any more prompting. He dashed out the door, leaping down the steps 2 at a time, and raced to his car. Fumbling with the keys, he started the engine and sped away, not daring to look back. As he reached the main road, he pulled over to catch his breath, his hands shaking. What just happened? He wondered aloud. The next day at work, Danny recounted the story to Sarah. "I swear it was the strangest thing. She vanished, the pizza disappeared, and the whole house felt off." Sarah frowned. "Danny, are you feeling all right? We didn't have any deliveries to Carver Lane last night." He stared at her in disbelief. "What do you mean? You gave me the address yourself." She shook her head. "I think you might have been overworked. Maybe it's time for a day off." Determined to prove he wasn't imagining things, Danny decided to drive back to the house that evening. As he approached Carver Lane, the sense of unease returned. He found the spot where the house had been, but instead of the old home, there was an empty lot overgrown with weeds and a rusted gate blocking the driveway. A faded sign hung from the gate. Property condemned. Confused and unsettled, Danny got out of the car and walked toward the lot. Among the tall grass, something caught his eye, a worn pizza bag lying on the ground. He picked it up. It was his, with the pizzeria's logo and everything. A cold wind rustled the trees as he stood there, piecing together the impossibility of it all. Clutching the bag, he turned back to his car, leaving the mysteries of Carver Lane behind him. Last-minute delivery. I was halfway through my shift when the call came in. It was a little after 9 p.m., the dead zone between dinner rush and late-night orders. I worked at a small pizza place just outside the downtown area, tucked away in a strip mall that had seen better days. I didn't mind the job. It was simple, paid the bills, and the tips were decent enough. The one thing I hated, though, were those last-minute deliveries that came just when you thought your night was over. The call was for a large pepperoni with extra cheese, and the delivery address was on the outskirts of town, one of those older neighborhoods where the streets felt too narrow for modern cars. I'd never been to this part of town before, but it wasn't like I had a choice. I plugged the address into my phone's GPS, but the signal kept flickering in and out. Figures. I glanced at the clock and decided to wing it. The manager had given me a basic rundown of the area, and besides, the street names in this part of town all followed a theme, making it harder to get lost. When I pulled up to the neighborhood, it was as if time had stopped. The houses were all these old, turn-of-the-century homes, huge porches, towering trees, the kind of place that feels like it has a history. Most of the houses were dark, save for a few porch lights flickering weakly, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. I drove slowly, scanning for house numbers, but they weren't easy to find. After what felt like an eternity, I finally spotted the house at the end of a cul-de-sac. It was older than the others, maybe a bit rundown, with paint peeling off the wooden siding and a roof that looked like it had seen better days. The porch light was on, though, so I figured someone was home. I parked and grabbed the pizza, half expecting to be greeted by a barking dog or someone opening the door as I walked up. But it was quiet. Too quiet. I rang the bell and waited. Nothing. I rang it again, then knocked. Still nothing. Maybe they didn't hear me? I was about to knock again when I heard the faint sound of footsteps inside, slow and deliberate, like someone was taking their time. Finally, the door creaked open, just a few inches. A man stood there, his face mostly obscured by the shadows. He looked older, with thick glasses and a salt and pepper beard. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking at me. The air felt thick, like there was something just off. "Pizza delivery," I said, holding up the box awkwardly. The man didn't respond. He just reached out a hand, his fingers bony and pale, and took the box. I waited for him to dig into his pocket for cash or a tip, but he just stared at me for a moment, then slowly closed the door. No thanks, no tip, nothing. As I stood there, something gnawed at the back of my mind. I couldn't quite place it, but something about the whole thing felt wrong. I glanced around the porch, noticing a stack of old newspapers by the door, yellowed with age. They didn't look recent, and there was a thick layer of dust on them. When I turned to leave, I saw a car coming down the street, an old sedan, maybe from the 90s, creeping along slowly. The car's headlights briefly illuminated the house next door, and that's when I noticed something strange. The house next to it looked identical. Same porch, same overgrown yard, same flickering light. My phone buzzed, and I pulled it out to check the time. The signal was back, and the GPS had recalculated the route. But when I looked down at the map, the address I had just delivered to didn't appear. In fact, the entire street seemed to be missing from the GPS. I turned back to the house. The light was off now and the house seemed darker, more worn. I shook my head, trying to shake off the weird feeling creeping over me. It was late and I was tired. That's all it was. Back in the car, I drove off, but something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. The house was gone, or rather, there was no house there anymore. Just an empty lot where it should have been. I slowed the car down and pulled over, rubbing my eyes. This couldn't be right. I had just been there, seen the man, handed him the pizza. But when I looked back again, it was like the place had vanished into thin air. My heart raced as I tried to calm myself down. I needed to get back to the pizza shop, finish my shift, and forget about this whole thing. But as I drove through the neighborhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That old sedan I had seen earlier was following me, its headlights dim, staying just far enough behind that I couldn't make out the driver. I sped up, turning down a side street, hoping to lose the car. When I pulled into the parking lot of the pizza place, the sedan was gone. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I went inside, dropped off the delivery bag, and clocked out. As I was about to leave, my manager called me over. "Hey, we got a call. Someone said you never showed up with their pizza." I froze. "What do you mean? I just delivered it." "Yeah, well, they're saying you didn't." My manager gave me the address. It was the same one I'd just been to, but the caller said they'd been waiting for over an hour and no one had come by. I didn't go back that night, I couldn't. Thanks for joining us on another journey into the unknown here at Dark Domain. We hope these stories have made you think twice about answering that late-night knock or wandering into unfamiliar territory. If you enjoyed these tales, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe for more chilling stories and remember to turn on notifications so you never miss a visit from the darkness. Until next time, stay safe and keep your doors locked.